On a warm January morning in 1879, the rolling hills of southern Africa stood silent, holding within them a storm about to unfold. The British Empire, confident in its power and armed with the pride of centuries of conquest, had marched into Zululand expecting a swift victory. What awaited them instead was a lesson carved in blood and memory, delivered by a nation that refused to bow. This is the story of the day Britain faced the Zulu Kingdom and paid the price. The British Empire had grown accustomed to expansion without challenge. By the late 19th century, red-coated soldiers had carried the Union Jack from India to the Caribbean, from Africa to the Pacific. Where the empire marched, resistance was usually crushed with rifles and artillery. Few believed that a traditional African kingdom could stand in the way. Yet the Zulu were not like others the British had faced. Born of a fierce warrior culture, united under a king whose authority commanded loyalty, they possessed discipline, courage, and numbers. They had not crossed the seas to conquer others, but they would defend their homeland with everything they had. The man who brought the Zulu nation to prominence was Shaka, a leader whose reforms had transformed a small clan into a formidable kingdom earlier in the century. His legacy lived on long after his death, shaping the armies that defended Zululand. By 1879, King Cetshwayo Kampande ruled over a kingdom proud and strong. His regiments, known as impis, were drilled with precision, wielding short stabbing spears called ikwa and shields of oxhide. They were swift, coordinated, and fearless in battle. To the British, they may have seemed primitive, lacking firearms and cannons, but those who underestimated them would soon learn otherwise. The spark for war came from British officials who sought to bring Zululand under imperial control. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner in southern Africa, was determined to break the independence of the Zulu and extend British authority. When Cetshwayo resisted demands that would have stripped his kingdom of sovereignty, Frere seized upon it as justification for war. An ultimatum was delivered with terms no king could accept. When the deadline passed unanswered, British columns marched across the Buffalo River into Zululand. Confidence was high among the British. They had brought with them regiments of red-coated infantry, cavalry scouts, artillery pieces, and supply wagons. Many officers believed the campaign would be swift, perhaps even glorious. The Zulu, they thought, could never withstand the power of rifles and cannon. Yet from the first steps into Zululand, the terrain and the silence seemed to whisper warnings. The land was open and deceptive, with tall grass concealing movement and hills providing cover. The soldiers advanced, unaware that they were being watched by eyes that knew every fold of the land. The Zulu war strategy was not reckless. It was carefully planned. Their generals employed tactics perfected over decades, most famously the horns of the buffalo. Warriors advanced in a crescent formation. The chest attacked from the front, the horns swept around to encircle the enemy, and the loins, a reserve force, waited to exploit weakness. It was a strategy of speed, coordination, and encirclement designed to overwhelm even disciplined opponents. Against an army slow to adapt, it was devastating. On 22 January 1879, the British established a camp at the base of a mountain called Isanawana. The camp was not fortified with the care usually given to hostile territory. Wagons were scattered, trenches were not dug, and sentries were posted with routine rather than urgency. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pauline commanded the camp, supported by companies of infantry, some artillery, and a few cavalry units. The soldiers drilled, cooked, and tended to their duties, unaware that 20,000 Zulu warriors were gathering beyond the hills. The Zulu army moved with silence and purpose. They had covered great distances with remarkable speed, barefoot across rough ground, carrying shields and spears, but no supplies of food. Each warrior carried only determination and loyalty to his king. At dawn, they lay hidden, waiting for the signal to advance. The British scouts had seen signs of movement, but the scale of the force remained unknown. When contact finally came, it was not a skirmish, but the opening of one of the most shocking defeats in British military history. The battle began with British troops firing disciplined volleys into the advancing Zulu chest. The rifles cracked in steady rhythm, and for a moment it seemed the Empire's firepower might prevail. Warriors fell in the tall grass, but the tide did not break. The Zulu moved forward relentlessly, the horns sweeping wide across the plain. Soon the British lines, extended too far and lacking sufficient ammunition reserves, began to falter. Soldiers discovered that supply wagons were poorly managed, and boxes of cartridges were difficult to open in the heat of combat. As volleys slowed, the Zulu closed the distance. When the warriors reached the British lines, the nature of the battle changed instantly. Bayonets clashed with spears, shields pressed against rifles, and the fighting became hand-to-hand. The discipline of the redcoats could not withstand the sheer momentum of thousands pressing from all sides. Companies were broken, officers cut down, and the camp fell into chaos. Some soldiers fled, others fought to the end, but everywhere the Zulu swept through with unstoppable force. By late afternoon, the ground at Isandlwana was covered with the bodies of over 1,000 British and colonial troops. It was the single greatest defeat ever suffered by the British Army at the hands of an indigenous force. The news of Isandlwana struck the empire like a thunderclap. Shock reverberated from the African frontier to the streets of London. How could one of the world's most powerful armies be humbled by warriors armed with spears? Newspapers demanded answers, and families mourned sons who had perished in a distant land. For the Zulu, the victory was both triumph and warning. They had defended their homeland with valor, but they knew the empire's pride would demand revenge. The smoke of Isandlwana had barely cleared before the British Empire prepared its response. The humiliation could not be ignored. In London, the government feared that weakness in South Africa might encourage rivals in Europe or stir rebellion in other colonies. The defeat had to be avenged, and the Zulu Kingdom had to be subdued. Orders were sent across the seas: more troops, more weapons, and more supplies must be dispatched at once. Ships arrived at Durban carrying regiments of reinforcements. Among them were veteran soldiers who had fought in India and elsewhere across the empire. Heavy artillery rolled onto the docks, and ammunition was unloaded by the ton. Engineers brought tools to construct fortified camps, bridges, and roads through the rugged terrain. The empire had learned its lesson. No more haste, no more underestimation. This campaign would be carried out with methodical precision. For the Zulu, the months following Isandlwana were filled with both pride and dread. Families celebrated the victory, but understood the danger it had created. King Cetshwayo continued to hope for peace, sending envoys with messages that his kingdom did not seek war, only independence. But the British were no longer interested in negotiation. They had lost too many men, and their pride had been too deeply wounded. The war would not end until the Zulu Kingdom was broken. As British forces regrouped, they turned their attention to smaller Zulu raids that followed Isandlwana. At Rorke's Drift, a handful of defenders held off a much larger force, and the story was seized upon in Britain as proof that courage and discipline still belonged to the empire. Medals were awarded in abundance, and newspapers printed heroic tales of bayonets flashing and soldiers standing firm. Yet even this celebrated defense could not erase the truth. Britain had been caught off guard, and it now needed overwhelming force to restore its reputation. When the British Army marched again into Zululand, the approach was starkly different. Camps were fortified with wagons chained in circles. Trenches were dug, and sentries watched every horizon. Scouts rode ahead, and supply lines stretched carefully across the rivers. The soldiers advanced slowly, but this time with an iron shield around them. The redcoats knew that another disaster like Isandlwana would be unthinkable. Zulu warriors continued to fight with courage and skill. At the Battle of Hlobane, they nearly crushed a British column by swarming through mountain passes, driving cavalry into a desperate retreat. The fighting was fierce and brutal, with warriors leaping from rocks, spears flashing, and British soldiers scrambling for survival. The Zulu proved again that they could match the empire blow for blow when conditions favored them. But the tide of war was shifting. At Kambula, the Zulu launched another massive assault on a fortified British position. Wave after wave of warriors hurled themselves against the walls of wagons and trenches, their war cries echoing across the hills. The defenders fired volley after volley, the smoke from their rifles hanging heavy in the air. Despite their determination, the Zulu could not break the defenses. Thousands fell under the withering fire, their bravery unmatched, but their weapons too limited against entrenched artillery. The loss at Kambula was devastating. For the first time, the Zulu army suffered heavy casualties without gaining ground. The battle marked a turning point, showing that courage alone could not overcome the empire's growing discipline and firepower. It was a bitter reminder that the advantage of surprise had been lost, and the British were now prepared for every attack. King Cetshwayo watched with sorrow as reports came in from his commanders. His people had proven their bravery, but the empire's resources seemed endless. He had always feared this outcome, that a single great victory might provoke a war his kingdom could not endure. He still hoped for a settlement, still sent envoys to seek a peace that would preserve the independence of his people. But his messages were ignored. Britain would not stop until the Zulu Kingdom lay shattered. In the British camp, the mood hardened. Officers spoke openly of bringing civilization and order, but beneath their words was a desire for revenge and conquest. Soldiers who had lost comrades at Isandlwana carried hatred in their hearts, determined to see Zululand humbled. The empire had transformed the war from a punitive expedition into a campaign of total domination. As the months dragged on, the Zulu homeland began to suffer. Fields lay untended as men marched to war. Families mourned the loss of sons, fathers, and brothers. Villages were abandoned under the threat of British columns. The songs of triumph after Isandlwana grew quieter, replaced by laments for the fallen and anxious prayers for survival. The kingdom that had once seemed so powerful now faced the grinding weight of an empire that would not relent. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Zulu spirit did not break. Warriors continued to gather, shields raised and spears ready. They fought in ambushes, struck at supply lines, and resisted every advance. They knew the cost would be terrible, but they refused to surrender their homeland without a fight. The struggle had become more than a war. It was a test of identity, of survival itself. The British, step by step, closed in on the Zulu capital at Ulundi. Every battle, every skirmish brought them closer. They were determined to strike at the heart of the kingdom, to crush its army once and for all. The memory of Isandlwana burned in their minds, fueling a relentless drive toward the final confrontation. The stage was set for the climactic battle. On one side stood the empire, armed with rifles, artillery, and sheer numbers. On the other stood the Zulu nation, proud, unyielding, and prepared to fight to the last breath. The war that had begun with humiliation for Britain was about to reach its decisive chapter, one that would seal the fate of the Zulu Kingdom and echo through history. When the British reached Ulundi in July 1879, they faced the full force of the Zulu army. 20,000 warriors assembled, their shields gleaming in the sun, their voices rising in unison with chants that shook the air. It was a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The British formed a massive square, cannons at the corners, rifles lined on every side. They had prepared for this moment with the precision of empire, determined not to repeat the mistakes of Isandlwana. The Zulu charged with incredible courage, surging forward in wave after wave. Spears glinted, shields pounded, and their cries carried across the field. But the square held firm. Rifles fired in relentless rhythm, artillery blasted through the ranks, and the ground was soon littered with the fallen. For hours the warriors pressed on, but the firepower was overwhelming. Eventually the great army of the Zulu was shattered, broken under the thunder of guns they could not match. Ulundi was not just a battle, it was the death knell of a kingdom. The Zulu army was destroyed and their capital was set ablaze. King Cetshwayo was captured and sent into exile. The proud independence of the Zulu nation was crushed beneath the weight of the empire. Britain had avenged its humiliation, but the cost was a scar on history that would never fully fade. The war left behind lessons written in both pride and sorrow. The Zulu had shown the world that determination and unity could challenge even the greatest empire of the age. The British learned that arrogance carried a heavy price. Though the empire triumphed in the end, the memory of Isandlwana lingered as a warning of what happens when power underestimates resolve. Today, the story of that war is remembered not only as a clash of armies, but as a struggle for dignity and survival. The hills of Isandlwana and Ulundi still stand, silent witnesses to courage and sacrifice. The legacy of the Zulu warriors lives on in their descendants, who remember the day their ancestors faced an empire and carved their place in history with bravery that time cannot erase.